So, as some of you know, or may not know, I am a sailor. And so this passage in Luke, I quite like. And a few years ago, I was sailing on the North Sea when, at some point, my captain said this over the radio. Pan, 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 pan. All ships, all ships, all ships, come to the rescue. Now, this was the second time he said it, with no response. If you don't know what a pan-pan message is, no worries. It is the international radio message for an urgent situation where you might need some assistance or help. The night before, we'd set sail from a little fisher's town in the northwest of Denmark. And our plan was to sail across the North Sea to the Netherlands in about 50 hours. We were now 24 hours later and about 30 miles later, which is not really close to the Netherlands at all. Because during the night, the wind picked up, the waves were getting bigger and bigger, and at this very point, our motor had just stopped working. Now, when I read this passage, I sort of could identify with the disciples. Although, if they would have a radio, they wouldn't call out a pan, pan, come to the rescue. They would send out an SOS, save our souls. Because the disciples, they were professional sailors. So when they came to Jesus, Master, Master, we are perishing, they were actually perishing. At least 4 of them were professionals in fishing, and they knew this lake that they were sailing on, the Lake of Galilee. They knew the boats that they were sailing. They knew the weather. They knew what could happen. So they are actually perishing. Their boat is filling with water and they are sinking. And it got me wondering. So there's Jesus, a little before that, saying, "Let us go and cross this lake." Well, did he know? Did he know what was coming? Did he know there was a storm waiting for them? Well, I'm not going to solve the problem of foreknowledge tonight with you. I don't know if he knew what was coming, but we do know that this lake, the Lake of Galilee, or sometimes called the Lake of Gennesaret, which is a place on the other side of the lake, is known for its stormy character, its stormy nature. And actually, Gennesaret itself means making a breeze to itself. And that is the lake that Jesus calls his disciples to cross. Now, what does that tell us about following Jesus? And what does that tell us about being a Christian? Or maybe life in general? Well, that I think a Christian life, isn't always easy. And it is not, I think this story tells us, a gospel or a story of prosperity, as some Christians in other parts of the world like to believe. It is not so that when we follow Jesus, we all of a sudden have a good life with a lot of wealth and a good health and a beautiful family life. No, we still might face a storm. And this story has often been explained as Jesus, who is Lord of everything. When he calms the storm, he shows that he is not just Lord over mankind, no, he is Lord over nature. He is Lord of the natural world. He is the Lord of everything. And when you look at the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we see quite a similar account of this story. However, there are some differences, because in Matthew and Mark, the thing that Jesus calms is the wind and the sea. Now, in the ancient world, the sea often had a double meaning. Well, just the sea as we know it, but also it had a sense of having a living power behind it, a sort of spiritual power. And so when in Matthew and Mark Jesus calms the sea, Jesus reveals himself as someone who has authority over all powers of the world, including that of the sea and of the storms. But when we go to Luke, and I'm not saying that Luke doesn't say that Jesus is Lord of everything, Jesus calms the wind and the rough waters. Now, in the ancient world, water had to do with, and often had a meaning of having a troublesome time as a person, going through troubles. And within the biblical context, it often was troublesome times for the children of God. So when Jesus in Luke calms the water, Jesus reveals himself to be the Lord of the storms that his followers go through. Jesus, the Lord of our storms. And so when Jesus calls us to cross this lake with him, that sometimes is very stormy, we are in the same boat as the Lord of our storms. And so we can trust him. And I think that's the question of this story. Do the disciples trust Jesus? In this passage, this is sort of the end of well, not the end, but it's part of a larger narrative, where the question is, who is Jesus? The disciples are walking with Jesus, and the question is, who then is he? It is, in fact, where this story ends with. Who then is this man? And a little before, in chapter 7, the disciples have seen quite a lot of who Jesus is already. They've seen him heal people. They've seen him raise people from the dead. They've seen him cast out demons. But I think this is sort of the climax, because when it comes down to their own lives, do they trust him? That was all with other people. But when it comes down to their lives, do they trust this man? And like I said, they really were perishing. They looked death in the eye. They knew what was happening. They were professionals. It's not as if your grandmother is sitting next to you in an airplane and after some turbulence, she thinks you're gonna crash. No, this is actually the pilot speaking, saying, brace for impact, we're gonna crash. And I think the answer of the question, do we trust Jesus? Can the disciples trust Jesus in this very hard time, in this dark moment in their storm? The answer is yes, because Jesus reveals who he is, the Lord of their storm. Well, up till now, this has been a very good Christian message. Life can get hard, but luckily there's Jesus who solves all problems. But in this story, Jesus wakes up. In my story, he doesn't. In my storm, Jesus is still asleep. I wish I had an answer to that. I wish I knew why sometimes life is really hard. But sometimes life just really sucks. And it is hard, and we don't know a way out. In this story too, Jesus did calm the storm. Yes, he did. But he didn't prevent it either. But I think the disciples knew in their deepest and darkest moments that they really needed Jesus. They couldn't do it themselves anymore. And so that is why they cry out, "Master, Master, we are perishing." It is in that moment that often we too realize how much we need God. One of my favorite Christian authors, C.S. Lewis, once said, "Pain is God's megaphone to a rousing world." I don't think that is to say that God sort of is this evil God who gives us pain so that we turn to him. No, I think it's because in our pain, we realize how much we need God. And in our pain, we need God to be God. We need God to do his thing, and we need Jesus to be the Lord of our storms. And I think it is also saying that God actually wants us to wake him. Jesus wants us to wake him in our storms. But do you really want to? Because waking Jesus up has implications. Another difference between Matthew and Mark and Luke is fear. It's an emotion that in all three Gospels come up. However, in Matthew and Mark, fear comes before Jesus calms the storm. It is their response to the storm itself. However, in Luke, fear comes after Jesus calms the storm. Fear is a response to life-threatening, crisis-evoking situations. It is a response to depression, anxiety, pain, stress. It is our response to the fears of our lives. Yes, it is. But it is often also a response to God actually working in our lives. The commandment, "do not be afraid," is one that we find a lot in the Bible, and it often has to do with God revealing who he is or what his plan is for people's lives. Because it is scary when God does something in our lives. And waking Jesus up, waking God up in our storms, often means that we need to let go of the control of our storms, that we need to give the ropes and the steering wheel of our boats to Jesus. And that is scary. When we wake Jesus up, he may do things that are illogical, unreasonable, that are uncomfortable, even miraculous. He may do things that we did not expect or did not thought we needed. But he will do things that go far above and beyond all that. So my question is, do you dare to step on board with Jesus? Do you dare to step on board with the Lord of our storms? Amen.